Rufai, your assessment on the state of democracy, or perhaps lack of, in some people's opinion, in Nigeria and Africa?
So the problem is, I don't think democracy has any problem. And when people say that when you look at democracy, it's not really an African thing, I will beg to differ a bit.
Afro-democracy is what they're...
Yeah, you know, the truth is, the problem is not democracy. It's the system that makes it easy for the strongmen to have a winner-takes-all mentality. And I'm shocked that those that are speaking, people like President Olusegun Obasanjo, when he was there, he also did the winner-takes-all mentality. It was under Obasanjo that we saw Rashidi Ladoja, you know, removed from office because he was not paying his godfather in Oyo State, Adidibu then, 15 million naira monthly out of the allocation, which was a winner-takes-all mentality thing. It was under him we saw elections that a lot of people challenged. It was under him we saw the reign where, you know, there was a sweep across the Southwest and only President Tinubu was last man standing. But the funny thing is that the same President Tinubu that was a hero that stood to fight against President Obasanjo then has now taken that strongman reign now because you do not have the checks and balances in the system. So the problem is not democracy. Read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. What were the tenets that kept American democracy sane as at 1835? Strong pressure group. The fact that there was a great level of individualism. Today, there's no level of individualism, there's poverty across board. That's why everybody wants to work in government. You know, people don't have jobs, so everybody wants to be a government spokesman. Somebody said something yesterday, today he can't back it up again. Most Nigerian politicians are agips, any government in power. He also talked about, you know, the capacity for the separation of power. That was also enunciated if you read Alexander Hamilton's The Federalist Papers, where he talked about the strong judiciary that can be a bulwark. It's not that you don't have a strong, high-handed, strongman syndrome in America too, but Trump is seeing that it's very difficult because of the strong court institutions. That's why sometimes he's even threatened to, you know, debar some judges. It's so bad to the extent that the Supreme Court judge made a veiled reference to the things Trump has been doing. So democracy is about checks and balances. And when you come back to the historical African society, there were checks and balances. Because somebody was a Kabiyesi did not mean that he had all the powers. What happened? We had various segments of societies. I'll give you historical context of Ijebu societies, for instance. In Ijebu society, every street was called an Itun or an area. The head of the street was called an Oloritun. So there was a sub-council within the council. It was the Oloritun that took all the pleas of that street to the Kabiyesi. There's also a Kabiyesi in council like the Oyomesi. The leadership selection process then was keenly contested. You cannot be a Balogun in mouth. You had to be a Balogun because you earned it over the years. But here, it's become a winner takes it all. Leadership selection process is flawed. Then you have multiple problems. So except we start to change those layers of accountability in our democracy, we're not going to go anywhere. And we're going to keep blaming democracy. Anybody that assumes the position of the president of Nigeria, with the kind of powers the constitution gives them, will misuse powers. Even those that claim to be saints today. Except you put checks and balances in place. That's just it.
Okay, the statements by President Olusegun Obasanjo and Mr. Peter Obi were made at the colloquium in honor of Honorable Emeka Ihedioha, who turned 60 and who decided to, celebrate and with a colloquium, with a very formal discussion about the state of Nigeria and the state of our democracy. So congratulations to Honorable Emeka Ihedioha, CON, former Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, representing, I think it's Mbano Federal Constituency from 2003 to 2015 or thereabouts. He later became governor in Imo State, and he was removed from office by that arithmetical, Solomonic exertion of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. But it was good to see yesterday that it still remains relevant, and it could still mobilize, the high and mighty of Nigeria to come and celebrate with him on the occasion of his 60th birthday. I hope he knows that this has implications. He's my friend, so I have the liberty to say that. Now, to go to the substantive issues, at that occasion, the issue about democracy, Now, you introduced the topic quoting President Obasanjo, who says democracy has failed in Africa. And his main argument, let's look at it theoretically, is that, look, the values of democracy, those are not the things that we're doing in Africa. That democracy, the Greek democracy of the majority ruling the minority and all of that, that is not what is happening in Africa. That is the minority that is ruling the majority in Africa. Well, in that regard, President Obasanjo may be pointing to the flaws in the democratic process. But with due respect, I would like to draw attention to a book by Farid Zakaria, who is an intellectual, Oxford-trained Indian-American, intellectual on television in CNN. He wrote that book, The Future of Freedom, a Liberal Democracy in the 20th Century. And he was saying that if you look at countries where democracy, has worked, those countries adapt the Western liberal democratic model to their own purposes. In other words, what Arthur M. Okun, in another famous essay for students of the subject, defines as trade-offs, as you have in the Asian countries. They have democracy in Asia, but they have been able to domesticate the democracy in such a way that it serves their own purpose. So at that level, I think that that's where President Obasanjo is coming from when he talks about African values, when he talks about Afro-democracy. So theoretically, that will be a justification for his argument. But where I differ with President Obasanjo is that, look, in the 1970s, the argument, theoretically, again in political science, was about strongman politics. When in Africa, people thought, oh, you must have a soldier, a man who is strong for the development process to move. But by the 80s and 90s, we had this wave of democratization across Africa. The big challenge that we face in Africa now is that when we expected that there would be democratic consolidation, what we are having instead is reversal. As we have seen in Gabon, Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And that in itself, is enough concern for somebody to say, well, I don't think this democracy is working. But I think the bigger issue and lesson is that in many of these countries that I have cited, the problem is with the leadership. As Chinua Achebe argued in 1983 in his book, The Trouble with Nigeria, is the leadership recruitment process that is warped. Where in this country, we are saying democracy has failed. Look at some of the people that get into power. Some bricklayers will suddenly become very important people in this country. They don't even know what democracy is. Some motor packed outs will suddenly become very important people. Is that how they run democracy, the Western liberal democracy that we are talking about? In some countries, if you did not graduate from Oxford or you did not go to a proper university, you will not be allowed to hold important position. So we run a democracy that is based on elementary, politics, that is based on stomach infrastructure, that is based on godfatherism. Those are the fault lines. And that is why I agree with Senator Tambuwal and also Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka that democracy is a work in progress. The values that we are missing, how do we address them to make sure that it is the right people who get into government? As for Mr. Peter Obi, who also spoke at the event, he said democracy is collapsing in Nigeria. I disagree with the view that democracy is collapsing in Nigeria because of what has transpired in Rivers State. Since the return to democracy in 1999 in this country, Nigerians have resolved that never again military rule because we went through the evil of military rule. And I think substantially we have sustained the democratic project in this country. The problem may be the leadership recruitment process, may be the character of the political parties and the nature of our politics. But I think democracy since 1999 has served us very well in this country, and it is a project that must be sustained. If there is a problem in Rivers State, that problem can be corrected. All the arguments we have been having in the last week is telling, the president and the federal government that, look, there is another way in which this can be handled. I don't think that should now push us to a corner where we abuse each other. And for Africa generally, democracy is working in Namibia, is working in Angola, is working in Ghana, is working in so many other countries. Namibia, yes, So we should not use Nigeria to benchmark. What we should do is to see how to move this continent forward and move this country forward. I believe that there is hope for Nigeria, in spite of everything.
All right, in spite of everything, we keep hope alive, absolutely. That's what we've been doing for the last 26 years, and that's how long this current democratic dispensation has been on for, following a return from military rule. And so that question posed is one for deep reflection, and I think it was quite an apt conversation to have yesterday at the colloquium, especially at this time of our democracy, where we're really thinking that what is going on, what we practice today in Nigeria, if you view the tenets of democracy, is it true democracy in its sense? I'll pick up from a word that Mr. Segun Adeniyi, whom we saw on screen earlier, said. He said, the challenge is how do we ensure that the operators of democratic processes play by the rule? And so one of the responses to that, which has been said a lot of times, if we're going to have a strong democracy, is to have strong systems. But unfortunately, the people who are meant to be the custodian of these systems, or to ensure that these systems are strong or work, are the people who benefit from systems that do not work. So for instance, the three arms of government that we have, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. To be fair, if we're going to have a strong democracy, these three institutions, these three arms of government must be strong and be devoid of personal influence. But what we've seen in recent times is one man. So these arms of government are determined by the person who is in power at the time. When we talk about systems, look at what's happened. I'll take an example from the United States, for instance. Remember what happened during the insurrection? Triggered, as some people would say, by the current president, Donald Trump. And when his vice president had the opportunity to support him in Congress, and he went against that because he was more concerned about the nation and chose to go against his principal and party. That's Mike Pence. How many individuals in Nigeria will do the same today? Whereby we have an opportunity to uphold the tenets of our democracy and defend the rule of law in our nation. We've seen what's happened in Kogi State. We've seen what's happened in River State, for instance, where we have called on other arms of government to check what's happening with the executive. That's what true democracy is, and that's why the question keeps, this is not the first time it's coming up, that what are we practicing? So some of the way forward, some of the things I would mention, because we've analyzed at length what are the issues or the challenges that Nigeria poses as a democracy, and if you look at the African context, a number of African countries toe the same line. The first is in Nigeria, we have to have a constitutional review. This constitution has been in place since 1999, and we know that the purveyors or the writers of the constitution, the states that it was in at the time, it is not relevant 26 years afterwards. We've spoken about how in this particular constitution, the president has almost emperor powers in terms of how a lot of power is invested in the executive. Yet we talk about separation of powers and we talk about true federalism at all levels, so that it is no longer a government by a minority ruling over the majority, where there's such an inequality, vast inequality in wealth and prosperity for the people, where only a few people are prospering in a democracy that should favor everybody. So that's one. If we're really serious about getting democracy right in Nigeria, we must revisit our constitution, and that is the work that we put before the National Assembly today. But unfortunately, lots of distractions are happening. They don't even have time, as it were, to face the issue of governance. That's one. The second part of it, of course, has been spoken about, which is the recruitment process, where our leaders, even the category or the conditions for service of our leaders, In many developed countries today, look at the CVs of the leaders. Many of them went to Ivy League schools, and many of them studied politics, philosophy, economics, because they understand that it's not just to have political powers or political godfathers that it takes to having the skills to run a nation. It's a lot more than that. But in a nation where what you need is just a school cert and a few people who are able to come out to you, can pay them some money to vote for you, we will not get it right. And so we need to revisit that in itself. So we've had a lot of discourse, but I think it's time for us to begin to move to how can we fix what we have currently on ground. What is the alternative to democracy today? And that's why I agree that I'll differ to say that, oh, it's not working, let's pursue something else. What is the alternative in Nigeria? So this is what we have, at least for us now. We need to make it work. We need to fix it as a nation.